Welcome to Your Next Chapter, the podcast diving into the transformative impact of storytelling on innovation. I'm Jeremiah Tittle, CEO of Next Chapter Podcasts, your host for candid conversations with creative minds reshaping their worlds through narrative. And I'm excited for today's guest. Our guest for this episode is Jerry Kolber, the CEO of Atomic Entertainment and a close colleague of our executive producer, Nick Kastner. An Emmy-nominated producer behind National Geographic's Brain Games, longtime collaborator with Pharrell Williams. I was born in Virginia, so that's my only connection to Pharrell, but I'm curious about that collaboration for sure. We'll talk about that. You have production credits on HBO's Sex and the City, Bravo's Queer Eye, For the Straight Guy, Netflix's Brainchild, and a long list of iconic properties beyond that. You're the co-creator of the Who Smarted podcast, a thrice weekly short podcast for kids that teaches them everything they need to know to be our planet's best possible future adult citizens. Jerry, welcome to the show.
Yes. Thank you.
So what is Atomic Entertainment? If you could talk a little bit about the mission, education, a big passion point for myself. So love to hear more about the inception and kind of where you've taken it.
So Atomic grew out of a partnership that I have with my old friend, Adam Davis. Adam and I met at NYU as film students, and he became a very accomplished screenwriter while I went off and became a TV showrunner. And about 15 years ago, I needed some help working on a project for History Channel. And Adam was actually between writing jobs, and it was a show about meat, which his father used to run one of these butcher shops in the meatpacking district. So he jumped on board, and we had so much fun working on this together. But even more than that, it was just such a successful collaboration that we were like, let's keep doing this. And the thing that really motivated me coming up about like 15 years ago was having spent about a decade working in reality television on some great shows. I had this realization, like I've always been interested in education and science, and I was just having this itch to figure out how do you take everything you know about making great fun stories in unscripted reality television and take all of that tools and that bag of tricks and apply it to shows that are educational. So, really the core question was, can we make learning fun? Could we make science fun? Could we make watching a show about neuroscience is fun and funny and engaging as a show about a tattoo shop in Vegas or some socialites on the Upper West Side? And the experiment for that was a show called Brain Games at Nat Geo. And we were very lucky to be at Nat Geo at a time that they were really open to experimenting and had an amazing team of people there that were very supportive of those kind of ideas. And Brain Games ended up being a big hit for them. The initial run was like 3 1-hour specials, and those did so well. They asked us to come back and turn the show into a half-hour ongoing series. And at that point, we were like, okay, let's just officially call ourselves a production company, because we've been doing this now, together at that point for 3 or 4 years. And so Atomic was really kind of born in and around Brain Games at Nat Geo. And I say that because the DNA of that show, which is, Brain Games is a great example of entertaining education. That DNA is at the core of the company. So every project we do, somewhere in there is you're learning something, whether it's obvious or not. But that is central to everything we do is learning wrapped up in a really fun container.
I love that. Yeah, it's something that, being in the education for kids space, as I'm the production director on the 10 News. It's a partnership between Next Chapter and our partner, Tracy Kaplan, who's the creator of the 10 News and executive producer with her company, Small But Mighty Media. The reason I bring it up is because news is hard to make fun. The educational aspect is super, rewarding and satisfying, but there are some subjects that we've dealt with wars over these last years. We've dealt with, we're still dealing with these really difficult issues. But I think what's really special, and I've watched some of our Brain Games in preparation for this, interview with you is it is so light, but it also, you always have some takeaway. You always have something you didn't know before, or you see it in a new light. So I just wondering, if you can share a little bit more of what making educating people fun, like how does that intertwine with everything you do, and then how do you make the judgment call, and if something's a little too difficult to make fun?
It's a great question. So my background, going back to high school, was I was always, even junior high, I was always like doing model rockets, going to the planetarium, like in all my spare time, I was thinking about science and cool stuff. However, in school, I was terrible. I failed math classes. I was a terrible science student. And whether that was, an intentional thing, or I just wasn't relating to the material, I was able to relate to it outside the classroom when I had my hands on something. In the classroom, abstract books was just didn't resonate with me. And I had great teachers too. That was the thing. I had teachers who I had friends who were like, these teachers are great. I'm like, I'm not getting it. So I think at some point, probably right around the time of Brain Games, I was like, is there a way to take what I know about making great, fun storytelling out of really inconsequential, stories, and apply that to science and education, and basically create shows that are the kind of shows I wish that existed when I was in school, or even as an adult, that you're like, hey, if I can get someone who doesn't think they can understand neuroscience to sit down and watch Brain Games, and at the end of it they understand 3 or 4 neuroscience concepts, and they're like feeling really good about themselves, not because they understand the concepts, but because they've learned something about themselves and how their brain works, that's a huge win for us,
Yeah.
And so that is the filter. The filter for us is what we're quote unquote teaching. We never really say teaching, but is the thing that we're helping someone discover and explore going to make them feel better about themselves, in terms of understanding something about themselves? Is it going to help them understand other people around them? Is it going to have a positive impact? That's the filter. If the answer to those is no, if the answer is, wow, this is really interesting material, but it's dark and it's not necessarily helping people understand something, but it's just kind of titillating and interesting, that's probably generally a no for us. The filter for us is really, are we elevating people's consciousness, and are we making sure they have a good time while we're doing it? So I hope that's somewhat of an answer to your question.
No, it's super helpful, because I really believe everyone learns differently. I might have been a good product in the public school system to a degree, but really, as I saw the light with the podcast world, I think shifting gears to talk about who smarted makes a lot of sense now, because I just feel like there is a whole sub segment of the population, the US and beyond, that learns visually versus through audio, or I think there's a number of different, all our senses can be used. I have friends who probably belonged on a farm at a very young age, and that would be really fulfilling for them. And maybe alternative education, people who need to not wear shoes ever again and just have their feet grounded in the grass or what have you. So wondering now about your audio career now, having done all these, big TV titles that are very familiar to folks. I'm just curious about I have the mission for Who Smarted teaches them everything they need to know to be the best possible future adult citizens of our planet. That's beautiful. Can you talk a little bit more about the show?
So Who Smarted really sprang out of our experience making Brainchild with Netflix. So Brainchild came after Brain Games. It was in 2019. And we had been introduced to Pharrell Williams through a mutual friend who worked with him. And Pharrell at the time, and continues to be very interested in STEM education. He's personally very interested in space and astronomy.
It's a smart guy, right?
Very, very smart guy. Yeah, very smart guy. In fact, his first group was NERD, which is
I know.
it's called nerd for a reason.
Yeah.
He's super smart, very, very well read, and really wanted to do. His kid Rocket was I think 8 or 9 at the time. He's like, I really want to do something that's like for people my son's age, but that adults would also want to watch. And really specifically, he wanted to do a project that would get kids who maybe wouldn't normally see a pathway into the sciences to see a pathway. So we're talking about young women, children of color who don't necessarily see themselves represented in most of the science stuff that's made. So Brainchild was the show that we came up with him. And it was just this great celebration of everything from science to emotional learning to exploring, and this great experience working with Netflix. And the show came out, did really well, and we had this interesting experience of having, on the one hand, this great success and this great project that we'd done, and it was just wonderful. And on the other hand, realizing, we actually put up curriculum for the show, right? So we put up curriculum for elementary educators that Pharrell and Adam and I paid for to create with these STEM consultants. And the curriculum was getting downloaded tens of thousands of times every month, right? Wow. So it was huge. But then we would hear from a lot of teachers saying, we can't show Brainchild in our classroom because either we don't have a Netflix subscription or it's blocked by the school system. There's all these like firewalls that happen.
Right.
And so we had this moment, we're like, man, wouldn't it be great if the show was somehow just available everywhere, at all times without needing to get past a firewall or pay for a subscription. And then, you have that thought and you're like, well, but it's not the reality. It's on Netflix. And then the pandemic happened. And when the pandemic happened, we're like, okay, we have this whole staff of people who just finished doing Brainchild. Kids are glued to their screens. Maybe we should create a podcast that is that, right? A podcast that is available to every kid on the planet who has an internet connection anytime, day or night, no subscription, short enough that you can listen in a car, fun enough that adults can listen. And that's how Who Smarted was born. And that's how that sort of arose out of that thought process of, how do we, because the problem with the TV show, we still make TV shows or we still pitch TV shows. We love working with the medium of television and streaming, but it's always going to be a more limited audience by nature of either subscriptions required or you have to be sitting watching a screen,
Right.
Like Who Smarted or 10 News, Kid, or whatever these kids podcasts, you can just throw it on in the car and you don't need a screen, right? You could just be listening to Who Smarted or 10 News. And you can do that in a classroom as well. So the barrier to adoption of the podcast is much lower than the barrier to watching a TV show. So that's why we've added podcasting to our portfolio, because we just think it just really expands our mission of having impact and being available and being a resource for everybody.
No, it's good to hear some of the backstory on that. I think the pandemic totally changed our business as well in terms of really diving in on connecting with folks online with some of our Shakespeare content. We're have had all these actors all over the country and the world. I was at SiriusXM for about a decade, and I remember late in that decade, a big marketing report came out that said, they counted not just the driver of the car, but a +1 in terms of like the overall audience that's being exposed to the content. And that's always been an interesting one, especially with the 10 News, as we're looking at, the parents needing to be entertained as well, which is something that, if it's a major bore for the parent, are they going to really play it for their kid, even if it does have all these great properties and they love it? So hitting both audiences at the same time. I'm just curious what your thoughts are on the differences in approaching like the storytelling aspect to children and adults.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. So we will never do a project that we don't believe can be equally enjoyed by parents and kids together at the same time. We are allergic to, and there's some great shows that fall in this bucket, but we are allergic to making shows that are just for kids. It's just not our jam. Like there's people who are great at that. our sweet spot at Atomic is making shows that can be listened to by a 30-year-old, a 40-year-old, or a 10-year-old, right? So even like Brain Games on Nat Geo is a great example. Brain Games is a show for adults. It was designed by adults for adults. Within a few weeks of that show coming out on Nat Geo, it became their number one series of all time, and became by far by a couple of decades the youngest average age watching the show, because kids, it turned out, loved watching it with their parents. And it wasn't written for kids, and I'm sure a lot of it went over their heads, but they're so curious and inquisitive, and the show was speaking to them in some way that they were able to connect with a lot of the material. It just became a very popular show for families. We sort of recognize, like, we've sort of seen that now. We recognize, okay, that's just something we're just good at. It's both a skill and I think something we're naturally good at, figuring out how to write shows that are, it's like a show for kids that adults will enjoy too, or a show for adults that kids can also watch. Those are kind of the two worlds we live in.
I love that. I want to take you in the hot tub time machine here and ask you about finance. With your background in finance and in Hollywood, you're working with some studios and whatnot. This may help folks listening. I'm just curious, why should creatives care about the financial aspect of creating content?
Well, I would never tell anyone they should or shouldn't care. I will say that if they're interested in building a business, they should care. But if you're a creative who's just like excited to create and put stuff out there and aren't too concerned about an audience, then, if you can do it without finance or wrapping yourself up with that, that's fine and great. We have just found, in order to have impact and reach an audience, like, finance just has to be part of it.
Yeah. I'm curious about the inverse. Why should business folks care about the storytelling?
The question of why businesses and brands should care about storytelling is so fundamental to content right now. So if you are a brand and you are still a business and you're just still making ads that are just traditional 30-second ads, you're not necessarily wasting money, but you're definitely treading water. We've trained over the last 10 years, we've trained everyone on this planet to expect an infinite number of choices of content at any time, day or night, literally in the palm of their hand, right? We've designed algorithms that actually cater to what you want. Very quickly learn how your brain thinks. There's incredible psychology around it. I'm not going to weigh in on whether I think that's good or not, but it exists. And so we have trained people to expect a stream of self-curated content to just entertain them and delight them at all times. So if you think back, like 20, 25 years ago, that just wasn't the reality. You had some cable stations, you had some network stations. You could rent a VHS tape and watch a movie, or a DVD, but you had to go and get it. So there was a limit. There was almost a physical limit on the amount of content you could have access to at any one time. And so everyone is just constantly immersed in stories, whether those are short form, medium form, or long form stories. They're watching them, they're making them, they're sharing them. And so if brands don't care about storytelling and they're still just thinking about, advertising and telling people why you should buy my product, they're just like at least a half a decade behind the reality of how people think.
Yeah.
I mean, that's, and that's why we've had a lot of brands come to us, really incredible, some of the best brands in the world have come to us and asked us to help them create content that isn't even necessarily about selling things, but more about helping people understand what their brand stands for and what their brand values are. And we had some wonderful collaborations doing that, because there's a lot of pretty amazing, very well established brands are really starting to understand, like, storytelling and connecting with your audience through authentic, meaningful storytelling is so much more powerful than advertising or one-way messaging.
That makes a ton of sense. I mean, they could take a note from Bill Clinton and many other politicians too, and what they've done to be able to get that credibility boosted and whatnot. So it makes a ton of sense for brands, and I think that was really well put. was going to ask you a question about some of the interesting places you've shot. Some sensitive environments, I understand, like prisons, classified military environments, top secret space launches, as well as, from marginalized communities and survivors of domestic abuse. I was just wondering, how do you lead with empathy in storytelling?
Part of my ability to do that comes from the fact that I started meditating in the mid 2000s. I started studying meditation with a guy named Ethan Nichtern, who's gone on to become a really respected author and Buddhist meditation teacher. And that allowed me to just create space in my head so that when I walk into a situation, I'm not walking in necessarily with an idea of how things are or should be, but I'm just open to experiencing whatever's happening. And, to be honest, in some situations I've shot in, I've gotten very overwhelmed emotionally. But that's part of the gig of, if you're going into a prison or a situation where someone's very sick or the victim of some sort of violence, on some level, if you're not having an emotional reaction, you're probably not being present enough for the story.
That's beautiful. Yeah, I'm definitely behind you on the meditation front, but not that it's a contest, but just a few years in, it's had such positive impacts on my life and hopefully my business as well. And yeah, it's interesting you say that, because I do feel like I'm probably closer to crying now than I ever was before, just working in broadcast radio or TV or anything. It's, there's a thinner veil there, that just being present and being in the moment. And, and obviously we're there to have a positive impact. So that's kind of one of the whole purposes of this show. So that's why I'm so glad Nick, suggested that you be a guest. And I'm just really grateful to you. I think before we run, the name of our company is Next Chapter, which the aforementioned Tracy Kaplan actually coined, and we gladly, took it on as our company name. But I think, in lieu of down the road, maybe we'll do some kind of rapid fire questions. But I just wanted to ask, what your next chapter is. I can see it in the path of your career, going from TV, not that you're done with it, but into podcasting and the various different projects you've done, whether it's, some evolution of your career that you never thought would happen, to kind of the future, what's next for you. I'd love to hear what your next chapter is.
Sure. So our next chapter, I say our because I think of my chapter as being entwined with my company in terms of work. So our focus right now is on exponentially expanding the number of people we reach with our programs, right? So our goal is to 10x our audience over the next year. And that's going to be accomplished through a bunch of different fun, interesting initiatives we're running with schools, teachers. We have 3 new podcasts that we're launching in the next 4 months. So those will each have their own audience. But for us, it's impact. Honestly, the next chapter for me is saying, okay, look, we've done these amazing things on television. We continue to work with and pitch with TV networks and develop with them. But having ownership of a listener base, right? That is there for your shows that you have a direct relationship with, like we do in podcasting, and not just that the ownership of that world, but a responsibility to them and a conversation with them is so exciting. And so being able to grow that and say, okay, that's awesome that we've got, 600, 700, 800,000 people, listening to Who's Smarted every month, but why aren't 5 million listening to it? Because that impact of people getting exposed to science and history and new ways of thinking about the world just becomes exponentially more. So that's the next chapter for us, is just, humbly and respectfully and diligently growing our audience as much as we can.
Jerry, this has been a lot of fun. Thank you so much for joining the show. I do look forward to conversations down the road, and maybe ways to collaborate, but really appreciate you taking the time today.
Likewise, man. Thanks for taking the time to have the conversation. Love to come back and talk more.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Your Next Chapter. Leave a 5-star review. I'm JT, Jeremiah Tittle, executive produced by Nick Kastner. We're starting with these first couple of episodes and dropping one every other week. So follow the feed to stay tuned for future episodes of Your Next Chapter.